What kind of world lets a man who once controlled millions of dollars sit starving in front of a full table, unable to lift a single spoon to his own lips? In a mansion perched along the quiet, tree-lined streets of North Shore, just outside Chicago, silence carried more weight than any order ever spoken, and tonight, that silence was louder than the empire Ethan Park had built. The dining room stretched wide under warm chandelier light, polished marble floors reflecting a table set for power, not for survival, and at the head of it all sat Ethan Park, once known as Ji-hoon Park, a name whispered across financial backchannels and backroom deals. A man who had moved millions of dollars with a single nod, now reduced to stillness in a custom-built wheelchair that cost more than most cars yet offered him no control over the simplest act of living. A porcelain bowl of soup rested inches from his hand. Steam long faded, the surface forming a thin skin as time passed, untouched, unnoticed, unwanted. Around him stood staff in pressed uniforms, their eyes lowered, their posture rigid, not out of respect but something colder, something practiced, as if they had been instructed not just to serve, but to ignore. No one stepped forward, no one adjusted his position, no one reached for the spoon, and the absence of action felt deliberate, like a rule written without ink. Ethan's dark eyes moved slowly, the only part of him that still obeyed, scanning the room with the instincts of a man who had survived too many betrayals to believe in coincidence. Yet what he saw made no sense, because this wasn't fear, and it wasn't loyalty. It was something else entirely, something that left him outside his own world. Just months ago, this same table had hosted investors, politicians, men who measured respect in millions and silence in contracts, dinners where a single misplaced word could cost someone everything. And now, those same chairs sat empty, their presence replaced by distance, by a quiet agreement no one dared to explain. Somewhere behind him, a clock ticked, slow and steady, marking seconds that stretched into something heavier, something almost unbearable, and still, no one moved. Ethan had built his life on control, on understanding every variable before it could shift against him. But tonight, control had slipped through his fingers without warning, leaving him trapped in a body that would not answer and a room that would not acknowledge him. His jaw tightened slightly, a faint attempt at resistance, but even that felt distant, like trying to command a memory instead of a muscle. And for the first time in years, the man who once dictated outcomes could only watch them unfold. The soup remained untouched, the air remained still, and in that stillness, something invisible had already begun to change. Something no one in that room, not even Ethan himself, fully understood yet. No one in the room needed to be told what to do, because the command had already been given long before the soup was placed on the table. And in a house like this, orders did not need to be repeated, they only needed to be understood. Mr. Collins stood near the far wall, his posture straight, his hands folded neatly in front of him, the image of a man who had served wealth and power for decades. Yet tonight there was something different in the way his eyes moved, never settling on Ethan for more than a fraction of a second, as if even looking too long would be a violation of something unspoken. Earlier that afternoon, in a smaller room away from the polished marble and crystal light, he had gathered the staff and spoken in a voice low enough that it would not echo beyond the walls, a voice that carried no emotion, only instruction. He had said that there would be changes, that routines would shift, and that from this moment forward, no one was to assist Mr. Park with personal needs unless directly authorized. And when one of the younger staff members hesitated, asking quietly if that included meals, Mr. Collins had paused just long enough for the weight of the answer to settle before replying, yes, especially meals. No explanation had followed, because in places like this, explanations were not part of the hierarchy, and questions only existed until they became inconvenient. Now, as the dining room remained still, that instruction moved through every person, present like a silent current, guiding their stillness, shaping their restraint, turning ordinary acts of care into forbidden gestures. A server standing near the doorway shifted slightly, her eyes flicking toward the untouched bowl before quickly lowering again, her fingers tightening around the tray she held, because instinct told her to step forward, to do what any person would do in the presence of someone who could not help himself, but training held her back, the kind of training that did not come from manuals but from years of understanding what happened to those who crossed invisible lines. Ethan's gaze lingered on her for a brief moment, sharp despite the weakness in his body. as if he could sense that hesitation, that flicker of something human trying to break through the structure around them. But when she stepped back instead of forward, that moment vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Somewhere beyond the walls, a distant car passed, its sound faint against the insulated quiet of the estate, a reminder that the world outside still moved, still breathed, still existed beyond this carefully controlled environment. Yet inside, time seemed to slow, stretching between each second as the soup cooled further, as the air grew heavier, as the distance between action and inaction became the only thing that mattered. Ethan had built his life on reading rooms, on understanding what people did not say, on catching the smallest shift before it turned into something irreversible. And now, even without words, he could feel it. Something had changed, something fundamental, not just in the behavior of the staff, but in the structure that once placed him at the center of everything. The silence was not accidental, it was organized, deliberate, sustained by a force that operated just beyond his reach. And for the first time since he could remember, Ethan Park was no longer the one giving the orders. He was the one being managed, controlled, and slowly, methodically, removed from a world he had once commanded without question. The realization did not arrive as a sudden shock but as a slow, tightening awareness that something far beyond the dining room had already been decided without him, because while Ethan Park sat motionless beneath the warm glow of the chandelier, in another part of the estate, behind a door that remained closed to the main hall, a quiet transaction was unfolding with the precision of something planned long in advance. The study, once a place where Ethan dictated decisions worth tens of billions of won, now held a different kind of authority, one that no longer required his presence, and at the center of it stood a man in a tailored charcoal suit, his expression calm, almost respectful, as he reviewed a set of documents laid neatly across a polished wooden desk. The numbers printed on those pages were not small, not symbolic, but exact and absolute. A total valuation of assets equivalent to 58 billion Korean won, properties, accounts, and controlling interests that had once defined Ethan's power now reduced to signatures and clauses that could be transferred with a pen. A legal advisor adjusted his glasses and spoke in a measured tone, explaining that all procedures were in compliance, that the temporary guardianship structure had been activated due to Ethan's current condition, and that the acting authority would ensure stability during this transitional period. Words that sounded orderly, responsible, even necessary, yet carried a finality that no one in the room chose to question. The pen hovered for a moment before touching paper, the sound barely audible, a soft scratch that marked the shift of control from a man who had once commanded every outcome to a system that no longer needed his voice. No alarms were triggered, no objections raised, because everything had been arranged within the boundaries of legitimacy, the kind of legitimacy that could erase a person without ever appearing cruel. Back in the dining room, Ethan's eyes moved again, slower this time, drawn toward the doorway as if some instinct within him recognized that something irreversible had just occurred, even if he could not see it, even if he could not name it, because power did not disappear all at once. It dissolved, piece by piece, until what remained was no longer recognized as power at all. The staff continued to stand in quiet formation, their silence no longer just an instruction but a confirmation, a reflection of a new order already in place. And though no one had spoken the truth aloud, it existed in every avoided glance, in every step taken away instead of forward, in every second that passed without action. Ethan Park had built his empire on foresight, on understanding the movements of others before they revealed themselves. Yet now, trapped within his own stillness, he was forced to experience something he had never allowed himself before: uncertainty without control, awareness without influence, a position where even the smallest change, even the absence of a single act of care, carried more meaning than any deal he had ever negotiated. And as the untouched bowl sat before him, cooling into something unrecognizable, the world he had once shaped with certainty continued to shift quietly around him, guided by hands he could no longer see and decisions he could no longer stop. The kitchen at the far end of the mansion existed in a different world from the polished silence of the dining room, a place where the air carried the faint warmth of food and the quiet rhythm of work that never truly stopped, even when the rest of the house seemed frozen in place. And it was here, tucked behind stainless steel counters and neatly stacked dishes, that Amara Johnson sat on a small plastic stool that did not quite match the scale of everything around her, her feet barely touching the ground as she waited for her mother to finish the last of her cleaning duties. She had been there many afternoons before, watching without speaking, learning the patterns of a house that was never meant to notice her, A house where people like her moved through spaces without leaving a trace, their presence measured only by the work they completed and not by the lives they carried with them. Tonight, however, something felt different, not in the noise or the movement, but in the absence of it, a stillness that extended even into the kitchen, where conversations were shorter, glances were quicker, and even the staff who usually spoke in hushed but familiar tones seemed to hold their words back as if the walls themselves were listening. Amara's eyes wandered toward a tray set aside near the counter, where a bowl of soup sat untouched, its surface no longer steaming but still warm enough to catch the light in a soft reflection. And she tilted her head slightly, noticing how it had been prepared with care but then left behind as if it no longer mattered, a detail that did not make sense to her in the simple way that children understand fairness without needing to explain it. She slid off the stool quietly, her small shoes making almost no sound against the floor, and stepped closer, her fingers brushing the edge of the counter as she leaned just enough to look beyond the kitchen doorway, where a narrow corridor led toward the dining room she had only seen from a distance, a place that always seemed too quiet, too important, too far removed from where she belonged. From where she stood, she could just see the outline of the long table, the figures standing around it, and at the center, the still form of a man she did not know by name but recognized in the way children recognize something unusual, something that does not fit the pattern of what they expect to see. He did not move, not like the others, not even in the small ways people usually do without thinking, and there was something about that stillness that drew her attention more than anything else in the room, because even without understanding why, she could tell that something was wrong. Behind her, her mother's voice called softly, telling her to stay where she was, to not wander into places that were not meant for them. Words Amara had heard many times before and usually obeyed without question. But tonight, those words lingered only for a moment before fading into the background of a different kind of curiosity, one that did not come from disobedience but from a quiet instinct that something needed to be done. She looked back at the bowl on the tray, then again toward the man in the distance, and in that small space between seeing and deciding, something shifted within her, something simple and direct, untouched by rules or hierarchy or fear, something that did not calculate risk or consequence but only recognized need. The hallway stretched out before her, long and polished and silent, a path that no one had invited her to take, and yet no one was watching closely enough to stop her either, and as she reached for a small plastic spoon resting beside the bowl, her fingers closing around it with a gentle certainty, the distance between the kitchen and the dining room no longer felt as wide as it had just moments before, because sometimes the smallest steps are the ones that carry the greatest weight, even when no one notices them at first. The hallway felt longer than it truly was, stretching ahead of Amara like a quiet test that no one had asked her to take. Yet with every small step she made, the distance behind her seemed to disappear just as quickly, her shoes pressing softly against the polished floor, leaving no sound strong enough to draw attention, no sign that something unusual was unfolding in a place built on control and awareness. The spoon in her hand was light, almost weightless, but the way her fingers held it carried a kind of certainty that did not come from understanding the rules of the house, but from not needing to understand them at all, because to her, the world was still simple in ways that adults had long forgotten, and what she saw ahead did not require permission, only action. The closer she moved toward the dining room, the more the silence seemed to deepen, as if the air itself had decided to wait, to pause, to observe what would happen next without interfering. And when she finally reached the wide entrance, she stopped for just a second, not out of fear, but out of curiosity, her eyes scanning the scene before her with the quiet attention of someone trying to make sense of something that did not match what she believed to be right. The table was larger than she had imagined, its surface lined with untouched dishes and carefully arranged settings that looked more like a display than a meal, and around it stood adults who did not move, who did not speak, who did not even look at the man sitting at the head as if he were no longer part of the moment they occupied. Ethan Park remained still, his presence both central and somehow absent at the same time, his dark eyes fixed forward until they shifted slightly, catching the smallest movement at the edge of the room, a movement that did not belong to the pattern he had been watching. Amara stepped forward, one small step crossing a line that everyone else had chosen not to cross, and though she was now fully visible, no one reacted immediately, because in a place where power was measured in influence and control, a child did not register as something that could change anything. She walked closer, her gaze moving from the untouched bowl to the man behind it, her expression steady, not questioning, not hesitating, just observing in a way that felt direct and honest. And when she reached the table, she did not look at the others. She did not seek approval. She simply focused on the one thing that had drawn her there. The spoon hovered for a moment above the bowl, her hand adjusting slightly as she dipped it in, the liquid moving gently as it filled the small curve of plastic. And then she lifted it slowly, carefully, as if the movement itself deserved attention. Ethan's eyes followed the motion, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. Something that might have been confusion or resistance, or perhaps the first sign of a reaction he could not fully control, because in all the years he had built his world, no one had ever approached him without purpose, without strategy, without calculation. And yet here stood a child who carried none of those things, only a simple act that did not ask what it meant, only what it could do. The distance between the spoon and his lips felt larger than the hallway she had just crossed. A space filled with everything that had changed and everything that had not yet been understood. And for a moment, the entire room seemed to hold itself in place, suspended between what had always been and what was about to happen, as the smallest hand in the room reached forward without hesitation, offering something so simple that it challenged everything built around it. The spoon stopped just short of his lips, hovering in a space that suddenly felt fragile, as if the smallest interruption could shatter the moment entirely, and for a heartbeat that stretched longer than it should, nothing moved, nothing shifted, nothing breathed beyond the quiet rhythm of a room waiting to decide what this meant. Then a chair scraped softly against the floor somewhere behind Amara, the sound sharp against the silence, and footsteps followed, measured and quick, carrying authority that had gone unchallenged for years. "Stop," a voice said, not loud, but firm enough to ripple through every person standing nearby, and the air changed instantly, tightening, focusing, pulling attention back toward the structure that had governed this house long before the child had crossed into the room. Mr. Collins stepped forward, his expression controlled but no longer neutral, his gaze fixed not on Ethan, but on the small figure standing beside him, as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had been instructed to prevent. "You are not supposed to be here," he added, his tone lower now, directed only at Amara, yet carrying the weight of every rule she had unknowingly broken in the past few seconds. Amara did not turn around immediately, her hand still extended, the spoon still held steady, as if the interruption had not fully reached her yet, as if the act she had begun was not something that could simply be stopped by a voice, no matter how certain that voice sounded. Ethan's eyes shifted again, moving from the spoon to the man approaching, and something flickered within them, something sharper this time, something closer to recognition, because this was a pattern he understood, a hierarchy reasserting itself, control returning to the hands that had been quietly guiding everything around him. And yet, for the first time since the silence had begun, that control did not feel complete, because there was still something unresolved between him and the small figure standing at his side. Mr. Collins took another step closer, his hand lifting slightly, not to grab, not to force, but to signal the end of something that should not have started, and the staff around the room responded in kind, their posture tightening, their attention sharpening, ready to follow through on whatever direction came next. "Put that down," he said, more clearly now, the instruction no longer soft, no longer optional, and for a moment, it seemed as though the entire room leaned toward that command, waiting to see if it would be obeyed. Amara's eyes finally moved, not toward Mr. Collins, but toward Ethan, her gaze searching his face in a quiet, instinctive way, as if asking a question she did not know how to form, as if trying to understand whether the man in front of her wanted what she was offering or not. Ethan could not speak, could not nod, could not give the kind of response he had once relied on to control every outcome, and yet something within him resisted the interruption, something that had already begun to shift before the voice had cut through the silence, something that did not align with the order being given. His lips remained still, his body unmoving, but his eyes did not turn away. They did not close, they did not reject what was in front of him, and in that stillness, in that absence of refusal, something unexpected took shape. Amara noticed it, not in words, not in logic, but in the simple way children understand presence, and without looking back again, without asking for permission, her hand moved the final inch forward, the spoon crossing the last small distance that no one else in the room had been willing to cross, defying not just the instructions spoken aloud, but the entire silence that had held it in place. The spoon touched his lips, and for a moment that felt almost suspended outside of time, nothing else in the room seemed to exist except that single point of contact. A simple gesture that no one had allowed and no one had expected, and yet it happened without force, without resistance, without any of the power that usually defined every action within these walls. Ethan Park did not pull away. He did not turn his head. He did not reject it. The slightest movement followed, barely visible. A subtle shift in his jaw as the spoon tipped gently, and the soup, now no longer just an object left to cool, became something else entirely, something accepted. A breath moved through the room, not loud enough to be heard, but present in the way shoulders tightened, in the way eyes lifted and then quickly lowered again, as if witnessing something they did not know how to categorize. Mr. Collins froze where he stood, his hands still raised halfway, his authority caught in a moment that had slipped past his control, because what had just occurred was not simply disobedience, it was contradiction, a quiet but undeniable break in the structure he had been maintaining. He had expected hesitation, expected fear, expected the child to step back the moment she was addressed, but instead, she had completed the action as if the command had never reached her, as if the rules that governed everyone else did not apply to her at all. Amara lowered the spoon slightly, her eyes still on Ethan, watching for a response not in words but in presence, and when he did not resist, when he did not show any sign of rejection, she dipped the spoon again into the bowl, repeating the movement with the same calm focus, as if feeding someone was the most natural thing in the world and not something that required permission. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on her, but something within them had shifted, the sharp calculation that had defined his gaze earlier now giving way to something less rigid, less guarded, as if the pattern he had been trying to understand no longer applied to what was happening in front of him. He had spent years reading intention, identifying motive, anticipating outcome, yet there was no strategy here, no advantage, no hidden agenda he could detect, only a child standing in a place she did not belong, offering something without asking for anything in return. That absence of motive unsettled him more than any threat ever had, because it left him with nothing to counter, nothing to control, nothing to predict. Around them, the staff remained still, their silence now carrying a different weight, no longer just obedience but uncertainty, because the moment had changed, and with it, the clarity of their instructions. No one stepped forward to stop her again, not because the order had been withdrawn, but because it no longer felt as absolute as it had moments before. Mr. Collins slowly lowered his hand, not in agreement, but in hesitation, his authority no longer fully aligned with the reality unfolding in front of him. And for the first time since the instructions had been given, the room no longer moved as one. Amara lifted the spoon once more, steady and patient, her small hand guiding it forward with quiet determination, and Ethan, the man who had once commanded everything within these walls, found himself doing something he had not done in a very long time, not issuing a command, not making a decision, but allowing something to happen without trying to shape it. His world, once defined by control, now shifting in response to the smallest act he could neither predict nor stop. The rhythm of the room began to change, not all at once, but in subtle shifts that could only be felt if one paid close enough attention, because what had started as a single act of quiet defiance was now becoming something else entirely, something that no longer fit within the rigid boundaries that had been set just moments before. Amara moved with the same steady focus, dipping the spoon again, lifting it carefully, her small hand unwavering despite the presence of adults who still stood frozen in place, unsure whether to intervene or to continue observing what no longer felt like a simple mistake. Ethan's breathing had adjusted almost imperceptibly, each movement of his chest slightly more measured, slightly more present, as if his body, though still limited, was beginning to respond in ways that had not been possible before, and his eyes, once sharp with suspicion, now held something quieter, something that lingered on the child in front of him not as a threat, but as something he could not yet define. The spoon reached him again, and this time there was no pause, no hesitation, only the continuation of an action that had already crossed the point of interruption, and as he accepted it once more, a different kind of awareness settled over him, one that did not come from strategy or calculation, but from recognition of something he had long forgotten how to identify. Around them, the staff remained still, but their stillness had changed, no longer held together by certainty, but by uncertainty, because the rule they had been given had not been removed, and yet it no longer felt absolute, no longer felt enforceable in the same way, as if the presence of something so simple had begun to erode the authority behind it. Mr. Collins watched closely, his expression controlled but no longer composed, his mind working through possibilities, through consequences, through the careful structure that had been set in motion earlier that day, and for the first time, doubt entered that structure, not as a visible crack, but as a question that could not be easily dismissed. Amara did not speak at first, her attention still centered on the task she had chosen, but as she lowered the spoon again, her voice emerged softly, almost as if it belonged more to the space between them than to her alone. "My mom said you helped her once," she said, her tone simple, without emphasis, without expectation, as if stating something that was already known. The words did not echo, did not draw immediate reaction from the others, but they reached Ethan in a way nothing else had, slipping past the layers of instinct and control that had defined him for years, because they carried a meaning he could not immediately place. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in an effort to remember, to connect, to trace the origin of something that had not been important enough at the time to hold on to, yet now returned with unexpected weight. Amara continued, not waiting for acknowledgement, not checking if she had been understood, because to her, the connection was already clear. "She said you gave her money when she could not pay for our apartment," she added, her voice still quiet, still steady, as if recounting something ordinary, something that did not require gratitude or explanation. Ethan's gaze shifted, just slightly, as if something deep within him had been touched, something distant, something buried beneath years of decisions that had blurred together into outcomes rather than memories. He had given money to many people, had moved amounts far greater than what she described without a second thought, had seen faces come and go without attaching meaning to them, because in his world, transactions were rarely personal, rarely remembered beyond their immediate purpose. And yet now, faced with the result of one of those moments, he could not find the memory he needed, could not recall the face, the place, the circumstance, only the undeniable fact that this child stood before him because of something he had once done without considering what it might become. The spoon lifted again, and this time, as it moved toward him, the room did not feel the same as it had before, because something unseen had shifted, something that no longer belonged to the orders given or the silence enforced, but to a connection that had surfaced without warning, without intention, and without any regard for the structure that had tried to prevent it.